when we introduced Randi to the IKAR community earlier, and I know some of you have joined us since, so you didn't hear this, we shared that Randi is married to Rabbi Rachel Kleinbaum, who is a very dear friend, and, oh my God, sorry, that was weird. Let me try that again. That Randi is married to Rabbi Sharon Brous, who's a very dear friend, in fact. Really, like, I call myself the other Sharon. Two other Sharons, you're one of them. And also just an incredible, brilliant, brave rabbi in the world. And I'm so grateful that we get to have you and your family here with us for this moment of celebration. And I want to start by reading one little piece from your book, which I was so struck by, and this morning we were kind of laughing at it together. But in 2022, the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, while speaking with a journalist just days after Democrats did better than expected in midterm elections, shared his advice for Republicans running for office in 24. He said, I get asked, who's the most dangerous person in the world? Is it Chairman Kim? Is it Xi Jinping? The most dangerous person in the world is Randi Weingarten. America, our nation's top diplomatic official, speaking the same year that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, the same year that North Korea test launched over 70 ballistic and cruise missiles, saying that you are the most dangerous person in the world. It's the kind of stuff one can't even make up. Why, Randi asks, would the former Secretary of State, who has literally sat across the table from demagogues and dictators, call a 5-foot-tall Jewish lesbian grandmother union leader who's married to a rabbi the most dangerous person in the world? And that, friends, is what we're here to figure out together today. So welcome to the Okay, so
and that's why we always still have to have our sense of humor.
Okay, so as Brooke Worcester, who's our director of community organizing, and Melissa Balaban and I were sitting together and thinking about and planning for this, we
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We were talking and reflecting on this particular moment, your leadership, and what this argument means, especially when it lands in this particular, in this political horizon. So teachers and their unions, you say, impart knowledge and critical thinking to students, create inclusive community, create economic opportunity, and build a strong labor movement. That's essentially the outline of the book. And in the book, Why Fascists Fear Teachers, you make the argument that fascists, including this administration and their billionaire supporters, are attacking public education and teachers' unions precisely because what you do makes it much harder for them to do what they aspire to do to this country. Can you lay out for us the problem, and why is it that fascists so fear teachers?
In a couple of minutes. So, first off, can I just take a speaker's prerogative to say thank you, Rabbi Brous, and thank you to this community. We have been guests of this community every now and then, like for high holidays, Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, and just what you have all built here is pretty incredible. And in a moment like this, and you'll hear me talk about community a lot, but in a moment like this, where you've had a week like this with such darkness, to have and to hear your drash today, and to be here in this community is really incredible. And I would say that that is part of why I'm just really, look, it gave me an excuse to see our grandkids, which is great. But that's really why both Sharon and I really wanted to be here, and really thank you for the honor for me to be here with all of you, because this is an incredible community that you have created. Thank you. And it kind of launches into what both the theory of my book is and why I did this at this moment in time. There were a bunch of people because the book came out, the pub date, as I have now heard from publishers, the pub dates are always Tuesdays. The book came out a few days after Kirk was assassinated. And so I got immediately from the right wing, they just focused on, the word in red? They focused on the word in red. They focused on the word, the other F word, as people are now saying. And I used that word because I wanted it to be a warning. And so I wanted to start with, our son-in-law is the one in Hollywood. I am the teacher. I'm far away from Hollywood. But I wanted to actually get people to think, oh my God, what is going on? Because number one, people in America do not know what fascism is. They do not know what authoritarianism is. And frankly, I would argue, and you said this so beautifully in your drash today, I've seen it. People do not know what Jewish pain is. I have more often than I would like, had to talk to non-Jewish friends or colleagues, because I'm the last of the Jewish labor leaders in the United States, of the major Jewish labor leaders in the United States, to say, do you understand our psyche? We actually believe, so I as the president of the union is saying this to colleagues, so they can't, it's a little cognitively dissonant for me to be saying it to them. And I would say, do you actually understand that it's in some ways part of my DNA that we believe we are one government away from a gas chamber? And you could see people's faces not understanding that because of how much we have accomplished and how much freedom we've actually had in the last 60 years. The arc of the moral universe has been towards justice. And so this notion that, we could actually be facing a fascistic government, and what Pompeo said is part of what fascism is. Find a way to smear and demonize your enemies to such an extent that you dehumanize them. You're not just degrading them, you're not just demonizing them, you're dehumanizing them so they're like specks of whatever, so that it justifies that you can actually walk all over them or kill them. Think about the violence that was done. I often use in Austria, after the Nazi takeover, the pictures of Jews on Shabbos in their best clothes, on their knees, cleaning the sidewalks. That's that kind of dehumanization. So part of why, the first reason I wanted to paint this picture and not actually call anyone a fascist in the book. I don't label anybody. I explain fascistic behavior. And I let people try to critically think and conclude what is fairly obvious. But I wanted to create that warning. And the second reason, and I'll get to your question, the second reason of the warning was, I was astounded as I was writing this, that the warnings that General Milley and General Kelly made to the American people, and they got scoffed at. How does Fox, how does Newsmax, how do people who are conservatives, who are military people, how would you scoff at Mark Milley and John Kelly? And so that warning and that education about what fascism is was really important. The second reason, which is your question, is that that in general, and I would argue, since Brown versus Board of Education and Plyler versus Doe, both of those, for the lawyers in the room, being really important seminal cases about the interpretation of the 14th Amendment. essentially saying that in this country, every child, undocumented or not, that's why I use Weiler, not just Brown, every child has a right to a great education. Not a substandard education, but a great education. And I know, speaking as a public school person, and I know we don't always get it right. And our job is to strengthen, not abandon public schools. That's our job. So here you have fascists who want to basically control through anger, fear, and apathy. And then you have school teachers. And so I'm not calling everybody who has smeared a school teacher a fascist, let me be clear. But then you have school teachers, basically since the Brown case, basically trying to create equal opportunity for all. Not having the resources, particularly in communities that are marginalized, not getting the support. And in these moments of great trepidation in the country, like AI, social media, anger, the fact that working folks, a working white man without a college degree earns about 22% less today than 45 years ago. So think about the kind of anger that has happened in the country. And instead of solving it, what happens is let's demonize, because we don't want to pay to get everyone educated, let's demonize. So you have that as a backdrop since Brown. But in the last few years, this notion, and you see it in Russia, you see it in Hungary, you saw it in Chile, you see it in Turkey, you see it now here, that rather that what teachers do and what public schools do is that they create the conditions that are antithetical to fascism. Bring community together, pluralism, take a group of diverse young people who don't know each other and try to make them into a community in a classroom or on a campus. And then, even more than any of that, critically think, discern fact from fiction. So it is the antithesis, it is the opposite of what fascists need in order to control a society.
Thank you, but I want to jump off of that last part. I think this is so essential. So you speak to a number of the folks who are the great scholars of fascism, including Timothy Snyder, who we quote often here, and you say that fascism is an approach to politics that rejects independent critical thinking and instead mobilizes people around fear and rage, which is what makes them more receptive to strongman leaders who then are able to strip away our collective rights and freedoms, which is exactly what we're seeing right now. And I'm thinking about a conversation that I was having last night with Professor Irene Tucker, who's here this morning, about the way that critical thinking is leaving many of our educational environments right now. And there's a kind of illiberalism that's leading to, there's a way in which people have lost the skills or the patience or the permission to ask critical questions, to hold complexity. And I think what that's doing is playing right into the hands of the people who benefit the most from this. I'm always asking, who benefits from this? Who wins, right? When we forget how to think, when we forget how to engage each other with curiosity and with care. And your argument from the book is, I believe, is that it is exactly playing into the hands of the people who are trying to take power from the individuals in this democracy so that they can amass the power for themselves.
Exactly right. I mean, I guess, there's another layer that the K-12 educators in the room understand this layer probably more than most. We have now gone through 2 acts of, and I don't think the Bushes or Ted Kennedy or any of them, George Miller, the people who wanted No Child Left Behind, this was not their intention. But we went through 2 acts in public education in the last 60 years. Act 1, which I talk about, which is Johnson, is that if you actually are teaching in a school where kids are walking in barefoot and they don't have breakfast or lunch, of course you want to create community schools, you want to create funding to actually deal with that. And that's when Johnson was a school teacher. He was one of my heroes in the book. And when he became president, part of what he did as part of the civil rights movement was not just voting rights and housing and accommodations, as important as that is, that those are, but education. The Higher Ed Act, ESEA, all of these things. The next generation of school reform was Bush, to some extent Clinton, but Bush basically no child left behind. And school reform became accountability top down. And it became viewed as everything through the lens of English and math test scores. Now, this is what gets into your question, why your question is so important right now for Congress. If you think about AI, and you think about social media, and Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, and several others, are now talking about this in really meaningful ways. It makes us dumber. And if you are a young person whose mind has not been, whose mind is still developing, and you do not have that creative gene, you have the gene, but you do not have the nurturing of it. And all you see is social media. You don't read books anymore. You see 30-second things. And it's not even all the disinformation and misinformation, which is a whole nother thing about trust versus truth, why community becomes so important. But think about what that does. So it is now undermining all of AI and generative AI, and the fixation and the addiction to social media is completely undermining all of what we need to do in terms of critical thinking. And then if you layer on that our education, well, quote, reform from 2000 on has been focused on English and math test scores, don't focus on experiential learning, don't focus on critical thinking, don't focus on all that. It is a terrible, toxic mix that is essentially saying what we're teaching kids is to memorize, and yet memorization is the worst possible thing we could be doing right now in society. We have to teach kids critical thinking and caring of each other and understanding what other people have said is the soft skills. So many of us are now saying, separate and apart from this book, we're saying, how do we actually get to a third act in public education that is about 4 things: a welcome and safe community, and curriculum that is engaging and relevant, so that we deal with all of this at the same time as the Department of Education, get this week, remember what I just said about Johnson, and needing to have kids that had shoes on their feet and meals. What did the Department of Education eliminate? Of course, illegally, but eliminate this week? All the money for community schools and wraparound services. So they want to make people unhappy. They want to abandon the federal role as opposed to thinking about your question. How do we deal with all of this to get to critical thinking? Because if people critically think and they look at each other as they're doing it, that is half the battle. Creating community and creating a curiosity, a discernment that you said earlier, to create a way that people see each other as human beings, to not lose team humanity, but see each other as human beings.
You know, several years ago, just before COVID, our community took a trip to Montgomery, Alabama. We went to the Legacy Museum and Memorial that Brian Stevenson and the EJI have built. And one of the things that we learned and spoke a lot about there was how how the impact of the reaction to Brown v. Board of Ed on the public school system, and the ways that all of these private schools and many parochial schools, including a lot of Christian schools, but then ultimately Jewish schools as well, ended up really doing damage to the system. And we have a lot of people in our community who send their kids to private schools, some of them to Jewish schools and some not to Jewish schools. And I know there's some phenomenal educators in those schools as well, and they're good people who make the choice to send their kids where they think it's right. And I want, if you can, to help guide us gently to look at the ways that when in large force many people leave the public school system in order to choose an education in the private school system, what are we leaving behind? And what is the cost that we're paying collectively as a society when that happens?
So let me first say, that is not only a complicated question, but let me see if I can unpack it. Number one, I respect anyone who sends their kids to non-public schools. That's people's choice. That's your choice, that's your right. And I'm not gonna engage in or do anything disparaging to that. And I understand why a whole bunch of people do. A whole bunch of people who are not religious do because of safety issues. And so my job is to make the public schools the best they can be. I often say, when I was the head of the teachers union in New York City, every single day I would wake up saying, what am I doing today to try to make every public school a place where parents want to send their kids, educators want to work, and kids learn? So my job is the public schools. My job is not all of your children. My job is the children in public schools and in higher education. That's my job. And so I want to say that as clearly as possible. That's different. An individual decision is really different than a societal decision. And what has happened in terms of society is that, and it's such a great week for you to ask that question, not just for me to be here, because another hero in my book, and I tell my theory through stories of people. And another hero in my book is a woman by the name of Barbara Johns. Now, for those of you who have watched the news this week, the Robert E. Lee statue in the Congress has now been replaced with a statue of Barbara Johns. Now, Barbara Johns was a young, and it's a statue of her as 16 years old. She was one of the young people who in Virginia, Prince Edward's County, she was a black young teenager, and she was going to a really, the school itself, I'm sure the teachers were amazing, but she was going to a school that the physical condition was terrible. So the white school down the road, of course, had a gym, had a cafeteria, had classrooms. This school, tar pits on the roof. When it rained, the kids had to bring umbrellas into their classrooms. That's how shitty, excuse my language, the school conditions. And she and her fellow students, black students, Virginia, Prince Edward's County, they had a protest about these conditions. And because of that, the people who were looking for the Constellation of Plaintiffs for Brown, this is pre-Brown, she was one of the plaintiffs. But they said to her, we are going to fight for the whole thing, not just for better conditions, but for equal education under the law, under the 14th Amendment. She never got to go to an integrated school. After Brown was won, what happened in Virginia? This is where, that's why I say the difference between a personal decision and a societal decision. What happened? All the schools closed because of, get this word, choice. The white parents should have the choice not to have to send their kids to schools with black children. Now, you know a lot of the other history and things like that. So, And because she was, quote, a rabble-rouser, her parents sent her to a different school system, to a different place, in the aftermath of all of this. But Barbara Johns became a school teacher, a librarian, a public school librarian in the Philadelphia Public Schools. She always, and now she has a statue in the Congress. Now, people like Betsy DeVos and others, what they've done societally, fast forward, as they're trying to dismantle the federal role in education. Personally,
I know this is going to be controversial. I don't really care if there's a Department of Education or not. I mean, my Al Shanker actually fought against the Department of Education. He wanted it to stay. Al Shanker was one of my predecessors. He wanted it to stay as health, education, and welfare. Mm-hmm. The issue is the function, not the form. Mm-hmm. But they are basically dispensing with the federal role in education, which is absolutely essential. Because how else do you help kids have equal opportunity? How else do you enforce civil rights laws? How else do you do these kinds of things? But as they are dispensing with this, in that tax bill that was passed in July, they essentially did a voucher give me for wealthy people that will mean that $50 to $100 billion of federal money will go to vouchers. And in all the years since Johnson that we have tried to actually create equal opportunity, we've gotten $30 billion. So all that money for kids, for individuals and disabilities, all that money in Title I, we've never been able to get more than $50 billion in all of that. TRIO programs, other programs for college students. So if one wants to actually believe in equal opportunity, we have to make sure there's a federal role that can deal with and accommodate to communities that don't have the property tax system, that don't have the state tax revenues. And that's what the federal role should be. It should be there to actually help create equal opportunity. Mm-hmm. So parents in a poor community don't have to say, we need to spend 500% of our tax revenue for schools. That should be a federal role. That should be the richest country in the world should be able to help all of God's children. Mm-hmm. That shouldn't have to be your individual decision. That should be a societal decision.
And it shouldn't be the teachers who are spending money from their own salaries to buy notebooks and pencils and crayons for the kids in their classrooms too.
And the last thing I would say on this is intentional. If there's anything, you don't have to agree with me in terms of my theory. I just wanted people to think about it. But this is one of the foremost conservative activists said at Hillsdale College, which is Betsy DeVos's college in Michigan that she supports, that in order to get to universal vouchers, in order to get to this basically fragmentation of society, you have to create universal public school distrust. So as the teachers are taking money out of their pockets, as teachers are trying to do the best they can with all that societal throws at them, it is intentional to create distrust of teachers and their unions. I'm not saying that we are perfect. We are not. And there's lots of mistakes I've made in all these years. But the intentionality of teachers, there are very few teachers I know in my life, and I know many, that ever wake up in the morning without wanting to make a difference in the lives of children.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I think a lot about and speak a lot about Hannah Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism and how essential it is for there to be a totalitarian regime for people not to know each other. And so I do worry a lot about, I mean, you speak and write a lot about the public school classroom as the kind of it should be a microcosm of America. We should be able to encounter people with different ideas and different backgrounds and faiths. And Rabbi Angela Buchdahl was here 2 weeks ago talking about what it meant to be the only Jew in her public school, but then teaching about Hanukkah, and people are able to encounter one another. And and Arendt writes that in the absence of that kind of communal space where we can encounter one another, there's the flourishing of conspiracy theories.
Exactly right.
And a move toward extremism. And I always think of this example that if it rains on your wedding day and someone tells you that the Jews control the weather, then you're really angry at the Jews because they made it rain. We made it rain on your wedding day. And then you talk to one of us and you realize that it rained on my wedding day too, right?
Right.
And so but if you don't know each other, if we're all in our isolated pods, very deliberately created as a way of keeping us from building that sense of community and bond, we really are creating a very fertile landscape for the very worst instincts to come in this country.
And you and I talked about it this week as I was rushing for a plane, and we had a brief conversation. The thing I worry about is this more than anything else. I worry about the fragmentation of society. Again, I'm going to say to any of you who send their kids or your grandkids to private schools, I am not being critical of people individually. I understand the issues around everything. But there is nowhere anymore in society other than maybe work and maybe schooling where people who are different come together. Yeah. And when you get to college, there's already a screen, particularly of affordability. And 40% of the kids who graduate from high school don't go to college. So the issue about the public school being a really important public square, a really important center of community, wrapping services around, wrapping programs around, it's really important that in communities, the public school is part of the public square. And I have said to my friends who very much focus on integration, which is a very important role, look, we were the only union who both expelled our segregated locals, lost a lot of members in the 50s and 60s in doing that, but also the only union who did an amicus brief in Brown versus Board of Education. So we believe in opportunity, we believe in integration, we fight against segregation. But if you don't actually make the neighborhood public school a real space, and in rural communities, it is a real space. In urban communities, part of what we need to do, I think, is work on both having a real great system of public school choice that starts with great neighborhood public schools. So even if you don't send your kids to public schools, figuring out a way to support them, because what that does is it creates for young people the habits of democracy, the habits of understanding. Think about the 3 words that Trump has made toxic: inclusion, diversity, and equal opportunity. Diversity was absolutely imperative to help Jews from going from second-class citizens to first-class citizens in the United States of America. Same in terms of inclusion. He has toxified words that then make it easier to create tribal warfare as opposed to bringing people together. De Tocqueville understood that even that young America really believed in this kind of diversity. The Statue of Liberty, this kind of diversity. Pluralism depends on us respecting this kind of diversity and this kind of inclusion. And that is the fight we are in right now. Can we create the habits of democracy? Can we help our young people see each other as team humanity as opposed to see each other as an enemy? And that's what we try to do in public schools now.
Okay, thank you for that. So I want to It's okay to clap. So let's talk about the Jews, if we can. I have heard from many Jewish parents that they would love to be able to send their kids to public school, but they feel that there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the system, and some of it in the teachers' union. They feel like, how do I know that my child will be treated fairly, that they won't be derided for having family that lives in Israel, that they're not going to walk into the classroom and be called a settler colonialist, in the oppressed paradigm, that they're not going to be kind of pushed to the bottom. And I wonder how you would address those concerns that I think many Jewish parents have.
So, number one, I hear those concerns a lot. So I don't want to minimize those concerns for people who are in this room. Number two, and I don't mean this in the way, well, I do mean it in the way it's going to come out. I am the leader of 1.8 million people. I am not their mothers. I am not their fathers. Normally, if I yell at them, they're not going to listen to me. If my only way of dealing with things that even I don't like is to yell at them, that normally is not the way that will work effectively. We have lots of resolutions on the books that say all of what you just said, Rabbi, that we should be opposed to all of that we should be opposed to anti-Semitism in action and deeds. We should be opposed to racism. We should be thinking about racism and anti-Semitism in the same way. So if somebody thinks about racism in terms of oppressor and oppress, someone should not actually turn around and think about the same way in terms of Israel or in terms of us here. So my point is, we have a lot of resolutions on the books that basically say we are against anti-Semitism, we are against Islamophobia, we are against actually and words and deeds to that. This is what I would suggest, and this is how I try to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. We have suggested, we now have a relationship with JCPA, the Jewish Council on Public Affairs, Amy Spatonik. We still use, I don't know if they actually still use the materials they used to use, ADL, but we actually work with JCPA, not ADL. We are not boycotting ADL, we just don't engage with them. I'm talking about the AFT. We are using JCPA because what we understand, particularly in a place like LA, is that we have to do a lot of work internally in terms of people feeling safe and welcome and feeling like they can actually approach these issues. So what I've said publicly and privately is that the first thing we have to do is make sure that we have a safe and welcome environment. I don't care what you think about each other, that we as school teachers, we as educators, we have to have in our classrooms and our campuses an environment that the people we are with, whether they be our colleagues or whether they be our students, feel safe and welcome. And by starting that way, it starts in a way that people can see, feel, and touch. Second, then we deal with the issue of hatred based upon animus, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism. And I often say to folks who are very, very much engaged and involved in either Palestinian rights, in Gaza, in Black Lives Matter, I will say to them, well, have you taken on issues like the Uyghurs in China, or or what has happened in Darfur? Have you, or is this the only issue that you feel this way about? But the reason I'm saying it this way is because then My job is to get people to start thinking and reflecting. If I simply say, I mean, it should be enough to say, I'm here. I'm married to a rabbi. Obviously, I believe in fighting anti-Semitism. So given that, I shouldn't have to say that to this crowd. But my point in saying all of this is if all I do is call up a local leader and say, you shouldn't be doing that, do you think that's going to have an effect? It may make other people feel like, okay, I did that. It's not going to have the effect that we need to have. The effect that we need to have is to do something like we did in Hillcrest High School in New York City, in Queens, New York, where one of my members went to a rally for Israel a few weeks after October 7th, probably the week after October 7th. She had a sign that said, I stand with Israel. And a few days later, there was a riot that she had to be escorted from by police outside of her classroom of people, kids in her school.
I remember this.
Kids
now.
in her school.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
This is the
Yes.
this is the cousin of a very dear
Yes.
friend of ours who's a progressive rabbi in New York.
So Sharon and I were in Israel during the time, and when we got home, I visited this member. Her name is Karen, and what we then did was we did a whole bunch of things. We said to her, Karen and I wrote a op-ed about this, so you can read the op-ed. We said, you can get a safety transfer. You can go to another school. Karen said, no, I don't want to go to another school. I love these kids. These are my kids. But what happened? That the kids, Israel, oppressor nation, look what they're doing to Gaza, and the kids got so roiled up that they were going to riot at her. She says, no, I don't want a safety transfer. And what she did, first off, we did a whole bunch of stuff with the New York City school system, which I'll explain in 1 second. But what she did was she and a friend of hers who's a Palestinian teacher, a few days after, what they did is they had class after class after class one day where kids came in. They had a Palestinian teacher, a Jewish teacher, modeling the behavior of working together and seeing each other as human beings. You said this today. The first thing is team humanity. Thinking about how we ensure that there is a safe and welcoming environment. Then we can get to other core issues. If we do not get to that, we can never get to other core issues. So all of you who want to engage in this issue in terms of LA, I'm willing to engage in it, but I can't do it by me from Washington, D.C. or New York City. I need to have people within the system who are willing to engage like Karen did. Now, what did the school system do? First, the school system, New York City school system, was really stupid because they heard about the riot on Saturday and the principal didn't do anything about it. And so that principal was out. Because you hear about some safety issue, you got to deal with it. Number two, they have created a curriculum in terms of Jewish heritage. And there is all sorts of money now in terms of teaching teachers how to use the curriculum and having the curriculum there in every school in the city. So there's a bunch of other things that are going on in New York City about this in addition, but the most important thing I can say, that's why I'm delving into this, we need to be able to change hearts and minds by basically thinking about people as human beings before they get to their sides on the issue about Israel and the Palestinian territories. And if we don't do that, we're never going to do the bigger issues in this school system.
I thank you, Randi. what you're saying reminds me of an article that a friend just sent me this week from the Journal of Higher Education. I believe it's a professor at BU. And she was talking about how when things got really explosive on campus, she's a Jewish professor of Arab studies. And she was able to bring together in very small and intimate groups Jews and Palestinians and Muslims and Israelis and create these environments where a small group of professors would model to a small group of students how to actually be in conversation. And it strikes me how essential this is in this moment. What she was describing on her campus is what we've seen on a lot of campuses where pro-Palestinian students are being harassed, are being threatened with deportation, students and faculty. And so on both sides, you have this reality where if the thing that you're speaking does not match the kind of orthodoxy of this moment, you are seen as a threat, as Karen was in the school in New York. And it just strikes me how hard it is to do exactly what you're saying, which is instead of coming in with a cudgel and trying to silence these voices, to learn how to speak to one another, how to hear one another and begin to grow in understanding. This also connects back to what you were saying about Jonathan Haidt.
Which is the heart of education anyway.
Right. And so when you're living in the world of the algorithm and you get more credit, the more extreme your views are, we're being trained right now to not listen and not learn and not think critically, and we have to actively counter that in the classrooms. And I think this is K through 12, but this is also in college and graduate school as well. And
in some ways it's worse because it's worse in higher education than it is in K through 12 because we believe in academic freedom, but we don't. Look. Columbia was terrible. For kids to feel unsafe, for Jewish kids to feel unsafe at Columbia, and I say this as the representative. Our union represents more higher education than any other union in the country. And so notice, I am saying this, and I am still the president of the AFT. I don't just say it to you. I say it to our higher ed folk. We have to create that kind of understanding, but we have to start with people feeling safe and welcome. And Columbia did a terrible job because people didn't feel safe. If you're spit on as a Jewish kid, you're not going to feel safe. And no amount of anybody telling me about academic freedom justifies somebody being spit on. And the same in terms of a Palestinian kid. And so I just think it's hard to, what I'm saying is hard to do in practice, but if we do those steps, safe and welcome, and then start dealing with how we see each other in terms of all of the other issues, and start thinking through lens of team humanity, but you're going to hear, and it's hard. Look, I'm a progressive Zionist still who is the head of the AFT. It is hard to hear people who really don't believe that the state of Israel should exist. And I will say to them, so what you're basically saying, look, I'm lucky. My wife is someone who has taught me, like Sharon Brous has taught you for so many years. But I can look at them now and say, so what you're really saying right now is that you just want the 7 million Jews and the 7 million Palestinians to kill each other. That's what you're really saying. If you don't think that there's a way that people can live in peace and dignity and both have a homeland, that's what you're saying to me. But the fact that I can get somebody into that conversation instead of people screaming at each other, that's a huge step. And that's why a union movement becomes important so that we can create an environment to have that conversation. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's good. No, we brought you here to speak. So we're going to take a couple of questions in a moment, but as you're thinking about if you have a question, I want to share with you what happened to me with Randi when there was a big dust-up between the Jewish community representatives of Los Angeles and the UTLA. And I called Randi, the most dangerous person in the world, and one of the busiest too, and you immediately took my call. And the three of us sat and talked this through. And what you suggested was that I pick up the phone and call the president of the UTLA, which I did, and she answered the phone, and we talked for over an hour, and something shifted, and I talked to her about my perspective was, and heard hers, and they ended up bringing in Eric Ward. And I told them about the work of Amy Spitalnik, who came to speak in our community, and about how essential it was, I think, for people to understand the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism, which is what Eric Ward has been teaching for the last number of years. And I just so deeply appreciated everything that you're sharing with us right now, experiencing that not just on the global, but also on the very personal. Because I think that we are going to have to actively counter the trend of our time to try to publicly destroy people who have power, whatever power looks like, by kind of outgunning them, outsmarting them, outshaming them, and instead figure out ways to sit together and talk to each other, because that's the only way that healing is going to come. So thank you for taking the time to help guide me through that. I really deeply appreciate that. It was an example of a case in which I think that there was a mistake that was made within the UTLA, and the Jewish community responded to the mistake with the full force of the established Jewish community in a way that kind of was disproportionate and I think led to a very painful reaction. And so then we're in this action-reaction cycle, and nobody wins. Not the teachers, not the students, not the Jews, none of us win.
Right.
And so actually trying to engage one another seriously, talking about the problem, and helping each other see and understand is really exactly the right answer, and I'm so grateful to you for that. I wonder if folks, I know that there are some people here from the UTLA, lots of teachers in the room, lots of community members with different perspectives. And Randi said she'd be happy to hear your questions and try to engage them. So we have about another 10 minutes left. So if folks have some questions, maybe we can start with David and Sean on this side of the room. Wait, hold on one sec. We're going to get you.
I'll riff, and then you can come up with the answer to the question I can't articulate, which is based on raising 4 kids in Malibu, blue state kids, picking them up and moving to the public schools of Fulton County, Georgia, for 10 years. It was more shocking than, as bananas as the anecdote you shared, Rabbi Brous.
Yeah.
And they were quadruple minorities in that environment.
Yeah.
The one thing that happened over and over was the intrusion of the fear, anxiety, and reality of guns.
Yeah.
Mm.
One of my kids' mates on his team was murdered by another kid on the team. The loaded guns in the middle school constantly. Here it is. Going back to the origin of this hour, you were talking about the political control over the schools, or the seeking of political control over the schools. If we had maximal gun safety politics in this country, what would that do to the schools of this country?
Mm.
My God, we wouldn't, I mean, these days, kids go through, well, I mean, Zelda probably knows more about what happens in terms of a lockdown than anyone in this room who's over 50 or 60 years old. Like what happens, God forbid, there's a shooter or there's a potential shooter. Like, think about why would kids, I mean, when I was growing up at the beginning of my elementary school experience, we still were like, well, what happens if Russia bombs us? So we had that. But this level of not just fear, but a reality that a gun could come into a school, or that we have this kind of intense gun culture, could you imagine what it would free up kids to do to have, I love that during COVID, this ridiculousness of, well, you need to open windows to have good ventilation, given that there is a respiratory illness. But you are forbidden from open windows because the lockdown procedure requires that you close windows. And so it's just an example that kids become the result of public policy as opposed to kids being focused on as whether public policy should be about kids. And, and unfortunately, look at what happened in, Australia. Australia has some of the best gun laws in the world. But still, since the availability of guns are so intense right now, you saw the devastating massacre. Mm-hmm. So, yes, if we had better gun laws, we would have less school and shul and other site shootings. But I think what we have to do is we have to even go deeper in terms of how to deal with gun culture.
I was sharing with Randi and Sharon earlier that I was preparing for this week's sermon, and so I read back something I had written on Parshat Miketz about 8 or 10 years ago, and the story begins that I'm sitting with my son, who at the time was about 6 years old, and an alert came in on my phone, and I gasped, and he said, "What happened?" And I said, "Oh, honey, there was a shooting." And he said, "In a school or in a shul?" Like, that was his immediate reaction as a 6-year-old child. And so the fact that we are still where we are is quite horrifying. Sean, and we'll just so that in case there are a couple others, we'll go to the question part of the question.
Thank you, and proud JCPA board member here. But you said just now.
Good. Tell Amy I raised JCPA.
Oh, believe
okay?
me, I will.
He will.
But you just said something that anticipated my question, which was about policy. You fight for teachers, you fight for kids, but bureaucracy's gonna bureaucracy. Every time we talk about the safety of Jewish kids, Palestinian kids, Muslim kids, black kids, gay kids, we can't rely on having a Sharon Brous to pick up the phone and have a conversation in private. We need systems.
Yeah.
So there's California, Massachusetts just did a K-12 strategy, California passed AB 715. From your perspective, what are the policies and systems that are best suited to do right by teachers and by kids of all backgrounds? What are the policies we need to be fighting for?
And
procedures.
In which issue?
All issues.
How do you write a policy to create safe and welcoming environments in which students and teachers can be taught critical thinking safely?
So part of this is, let me say it this way. We have 16,000 school districts. This is why I love when people say, first off, I tried to get schools opened after COVID from the month after COVID started, like April 2020. So all of the propaganda about this it's propaganda. But the reason I use these 4 words, safe, welcoming, curriculum that is engaging and relevant, is because in the United States of America, we have 50 states that control schools. We have 16,000 school districts. We have 100,000 schools. So there's not going to be one policy that gets written because people are then going to fight around that policy. But if we can have the concepts of what do you want to see in a school, that's why I talk about I want to see every public school to be a place that parents feel comfortable sending their kids. That says to me that the school is going to be safe and welcoming. That says to me that a parent likes the curriculum. That says to me a parent likes the teachers. When I say the second piece, that teachers want to be there. If a teacher wants to be there, then a teacher is going to find every single which way that is well beyond their hours that they're working during the day. They will find ways to actually make the magic happen. And that kids have to be the center. And the way I think we do that is if we can actually think about these 2 concepts or these 4 words, safe and welcoming, with curriculum that is engaging and relevant. And curriculum that is engaging and relevant means, in this moment of AI, not memorization, but it really means project-based instruction. It means working together as teams. And frankly, I've become very much of an evangelist on the issue of career and tech ed. Because what I have seen with career and tech ed is that is some of the only ways around America that kids do a project, they do a project together, they're thinking with each other, they see what the project looks like, and they get some certifications as part of it. And so it's what debate is, it's what after-school programs are, it's what sports are. This kind of work, extracurricular activities, career tech ed, curriculum that is engaging and relevant. So I think about those 4 words as opposed to policy.
Okay, I know that there's still a couple of questions here, but we're now at 2 o'clock. So what I'm going to do is we're going to wrap, and if it's okay with you, if there are a couple of people who still have questions and want to come up and engage with Randi, we'll do that. Randi, thank God for you. I'm so grateful that you are alive in this world, doing what you're doing. May you continue to find great strength and know that there's a bunch of Jews in LA who've got your back, and we're super grateful for you. And thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom, Chanukah Sameach, and Chodesh Tov.